Welcome. I'm Christina Troutman from Business Intelligence Consulting Group, recently acquired by Capgemini. Thank you so much for joining us today for another edition in the BICG webinar series. Today our webinar is titled OBIEE and PeopleSoft, a Technical Perspective. Your presenter today will be Mark Johnson. Mark is a Capgemini solution consultant, and he's been a PeopleSoft developer and admin for over 15 years and has been working with the OBIEE product for the past 2 years. A little about the flow of today's event. Mark will present, and then we'll have time at the end of our presentation for a brief question and answer session. We encourage you to ask questions, and they can be submitted anytime through the question pane on your control panel. Also, please be sure to stay until the end of our webinar, as we'll be giving away free training tokens to lucky attendees. Without further ado, let's begin today's presentation. And with that, I hand it over to Mark.
Hello, good morning or afternoon, wherever you are. As Steve mentioned, I am Mark Johnson. I've been a PeopleSoft developer and admin for quite some time. And most of my OBI work has been as a system administrator, but done a little bit of development. So let's just take a look at the agenda. I'm going to go over some real basics for OBIEE and data warehousing. I realize there's a lot of BI experts on the call today. Hopefully you'll bear with us for the PeopleSoft people who are also on the call who may not be that familiar with data warehousing and the BI tools from Oracle. And then we'll look a little bit at the solutions that Oracle offers for people using PeopleSoft or other Oracle ERP applications. Then to look at content integration, how you can get content and navigate back and forth between the two applications. And then probably spend most of the time looking really at the security integration pieces related to the two products. So before we get started, I have a safe harbor statement. It's a little different than what you usually see. I'm not a sales and marketing guy, and due to the difficulties of running a demonstration of PeopleSoft and OBIEE all on a laptop, there will be no demos today. So I basically can't be responsible for any head or neck injuries that result from today's presentation. So take a real quick look at the typical PeopleSoft data models and reporting environment. So as PeopleSoft developers and users, we're probably all familiar with the typical ERP normalized database structures. And the kind of relationships that have to be maintained among those and understood as users when we're developing our reports and queries. If we're lucky and have a big monitor, we can actually make some sense out of the PeopleSoft entity relationship diagrams that Oracle provides to show those relationships. Basically, the result for a reporting perspective is the kind of query SQL that gets generated by the PeopleSoft query tool or other reporting tools. Lots of joins to lots of tables, and users have to understand those joins and make sure they get all the key fields joined up and criteria right. But a lot of times that doesn't happen, so the solution to that problem is to basically take a copy of our production database, call it the reporting database, throw PeopleSoft query users on top of that, and let them go and not worry about what impact their reporting has on production instance. That really isn't database warehousing nor business intelligence. So the warehouse data model is a completely different shape. You'll see that it's a very simple structure. It's called a star schema or a dimensional model. I'm not going to get into a lot of details on how that works. But one of the key things that we'll find when we get to the security piece is that these facts and dimensions are joined by something called a surrogate ID, which is just a numeric non-business field that makes it easy to join up the facts in the dimension tables, but doesn't involve business logic in the table joins. That doesn't mean you can't query by a department ID, an employee ID, or a business unit. It's just a data warehousing technique. And then on top of that warehouse, we usually put a business intelligence tool, which will simplify the querying, provide drill down and roll up capabilities, as well as other analysis. So that's data warehousing in a nutshell. Now the BI product from Oracle is basically a set of server processes that help us pull data out of the warehouse and present it to the user. There's several server processes. The picture here we're looking at is a very simplified kind of version of the actual BI architecture from OBIEE. But in addition to the actual server processes, we have a couple of other components that go along with that. The metadata repository, which basically kind of describes where our data exists, how that data is related, rules around how that should be queried, how tables should be joined, as well as security control pieces. And there is also a catalog, which basically groups or is the actual reports and dashboards that end users see. So the OBIEE platform from Oracle itself is basically the server processes and the administration tools. There is actually no metadata repository. There's no catalog. There is also no data warehouse database or a schema to go along with that. It's simply the reporting tool. Before we move away from that, I just want to point out that in addition to being able to get at the data through the BI Analytics web application, it is possible for users to have direct access to the BI server, so you can work with other tools besides the web application. You're able to do that through Java database connectivity or ODBC tools, and we'll see a little bit about how that was needed in the case study that we're going to look at throughout the presentation. Real quickly, the admin tool and the repository, just kind of want to go over this briefly enough to let PeopleSoft people understand where joins and the security pieces are set up. The repository administration tool basically shows you kind of three layers. The physical layer is actually the data sources and database tables, views of those, and the joins that exist between those. Then we get to the business model, which is really more how tables work together, what tables we're going to query, how the data will be organized and aggregated, and finally a presentation layer, which actually is what columns and tables will the users see in either the web tool or any other access tool. Even if they're coming directly to the BI server, everybody sees the tables and columns that are exposed in this presentation layer. So that was a real quick overview for our PeopleSoft people on the call. To get a little more information about that, BICG does offer some free self-paced training related to data warehousing concepts and the OBIEE architecture. Now, I don't want to sound too much like a shill, but when I actually started working with OBIEE and warehousing 2 years ago, a consultant from a different implementation vendor actually referred me to the BICG site for this real basic training. So I had some idea of what I was going to be working on. So as I mentioned, that the BI platform tool itself does not really have any sort of built-in solution for our ERP applications. So for that, Oracle has developed two other products. One is called Business Intelligence Application, and the other is the PeopleSoft Enterprise Performance Management Application. So basically, as a PeopleSoft application, we would have our typical HCM or campus solutions or financial and supply chain database. And then we would put the OBIEE platform on top of that, and there's really nothing for that. And so that's where there's nothing connecting the two, and that's where the two Oracle delivered solutions come into play. Both the BI apps and PeopleSoft EPM deliver a database warehouse. On the BI side, it's called the Analytics Warehouse. In PeopleSoft EPM, it's called the Multi-Dimensional Warehouse component of PeopleSoft EPM database. So in addition to basically delivering the database schema, the table definitions, there is ETL tools and scripts to basically move the data from the ERP application database into the warehouse. And then there are the repository and catalog that go on top of the BI platform to basically pull that data out of the warehouse and present it to users. A little more detail on each of those solutions. The BI apps are Oracle's strategic sort of go-forward business intelligence solution. You'll hear them called financial analytics, HR analytics, basically all the different ERP applications that you have analytics for those different things, and you can purchase one or all of those different analytics components when you purchase BI apps. PeopleSoft Enterprise Management Performance Application is similar, and the one thing that is in that is not available in the BI apps is the higher ed and public sector data marts and the related ETL jobs and reports that go along with that. With PeopleSoft EPM, you do get a pre-delivered Oracle BI repository and the catalog. Keep in mind that EPM also does a lot of other online analytical processing, fund transfer, pricing, other applications for forecasting and modeling that really aren't related to warehouse reporting. And also that there is the Hyperion Enterprise Performance Management product, which is completely different than the PeopleSoft EPM offering. So moving on to the content integration, I'm going to basically take a quick look at how we would go about getting content from OBIEE into PeopleSoft, and then how we'll navigate back and forth between the two applications. Simplest thing, and really is not considered content integration, would simply be to put a link in on your PeopleSoft application page that directs users to the Oracle Business Intelligence web page. But you are also able to embed reports into PeopleSoft pages, embed dashboards into the portal, and with People 2085, you have the option of actually using OBI reports as a data source for the portal pagelet wizard. Again, that's only for People 2085 and above. So when you're setting up a link to OBIEE from PeopleSoft, there are several ways in PeopleSoft that you are actually able to put links in. You can simply use the People Tools URL object. You can also use the portal content reference, and in that you have the option of basically simply coding your URL in as part of that content reference, or if needed, you can create an iScript to give you a little more flexibility and basically build the URL based on parameters defined in that content reference. And it's probably a little hard to read, but here you can see we have a script which is basically going to look at some of the parameters in this particular content reference to build the URL. And basically doing that because we needed during our development and testing to be able to actually use the cookie as a user ID or send it as part of a username and password combination, or simply not include it at all and have the cookie go as part of the browser. And that cookie, again, is the PeopleSoft authentication token cookie. I'll take a bit of a closer look at that. But for the people who don't, or people who aren't familiar with the PS token cookie, it's simply a way that the PeopleSoft web server is able to validate that a user has actually recently signed in to the PeopleSoft application. So when you want to actually embed the OBIE content into your PeopleSoft page, basically we'll put an HTML object on our PeopleSoft page and develop some people code to basically, again, build a BI URL for us, and then go out and execute that URL and return the content to our HTML object on our PeopleSoft page. Just a closer look at one of those PeopleSoft pages that actually includes on at the bottom the OBIEE report. So, and the final option for getting OBIEE content into PeopleSoft is the People Tools 8.5 portal. There, PeopleSoft has delivered essentially a framework that allows us to get reports in and use those, excuse me, use those reports as a data source for the Pagelet wizard. Few different steps that actually have to go along with getting that ready. There are some admin tasks, one-time things, and then ongoing things that users would do when they want to put reports onto their own pages and pagelets. So initially, with OBIEE, the web service piece was fairly straightforward and simple to access. We just simply had to have a user who had administrator credentials within the OBIEE tool. In OBIEE 11G, it's a little more complex. Security and impersonation and web service access has been split out into some different pieces. So if you're using OBIEE 11G, there is a little bit of setup that we're going to need to do to make sure you can have a user who can impersonate another user, or that user can also access the BI web services. Then inside of PeopleSoft, we actually have to do some setup of the PeopleSoft portal. We go out and we say, where is our OBIEE server, basically a URL to that server, along with a user ID and password, so credentials for logging into that BI server. And then finally, as a setup step, we have to define ahead of time the reports that we want to make available and import those reports in, just the definitions of those reports. You're not defining any content, but just saying which reports am I going to make available as sources for the Pagelet wizard. And then finally, when users want to go out and put pagelets on their home page or in other parts of the application, they run the Pagelet wizard to add that OBIEE content to the page, and then they can put the page in their PeopleSoft application as they see fit. So once you are in OBIEE, you can also then navigate back to the PeopleSoft application using the OBIEE feature action links. So basically, you, when you're building your report, you can basically take a value from that report, use that OBIEE value to dynamically build a PeopleSoft URL and have that value essentially show up as a link on your OBIEE report, so that when the user would drill down to that, they would actually be brought to the PeopleSoft application, to the specific page that you define where they should go. One thing to note is that the OBIEE action links, in addition to actually navigating to a URL, could actually invoke PeopleSoft web services. So if based on the data on the page, when a user would click that, if you would want to allow them to initiate a report or potentially even update data in PeopleSoft, you could develop web services on the PeopleSoft side that would be essentially executed by the OBIEE user on the BI report page. So now let's take a look at how some of the security pieces tie together. With the security, we have three different components. We have authentication, and are you a valid user? There's authorization. What sort of things can you do within the application? And finally, there's data security. What rows of data can you see? What columns of data can you see? What types of data masking are we going to use? So we're going to take a look at basically a case study here. It was a public sector entity where we basically used essentially all three of these areas of security, including actually using our PeopleSoft system to authenticate our OBIEE users. And again, we either did that based on the value of a PS token cookie if they were logged into PeopleSoft. And we also essentially wanted them to be able to access the BI server directly with tools like Java or Crystal Reports. And in that case, we needed to be able to have them log in to the BI server actually using their PeopleSoft user credentials. Once they were authenticated, we wanted to get their roles out of PeopleSoft instead of having to maintain roles in the BI application as well as PeopleSoft. So we basically used the BI authorization to use PeopleSoft roles. And finally, we used a variety of data security things, simply which columns and tables user could access, what rows of data PeopleSoft, or what rows of data users could get based on PeopleSoft security, and finally some data masking to hide sensitive data. So we'll take a bit of a closer look at all of these. I just wanted to put the high-level sort of flow of all the things that go on in the security integration pieces. So authentication, OBIEE and PeopleSoft both work with industry standard single sign-on servers, LDAP servers. So you can simply configure both systems to share the same single sign-on server. And once a user has essentially authenticated against that server, they're set for either the PeopleSoft or the OBIEE users. Now, when you have a single sign-on server to use, this is where we would use the PS token. Again, the PS token is a cookie that is generated by the PeopleSoft web server. It basically identifies a user that is valid, currently valid, is not timed out. And that cookie is basically maintained by the web server. But we can use that cookie to basically say, okay, store that cookie in a table, and then when we go from PeopleSoft to OBIEE, we pass that cookie along with that request. And once OBIEE gets that request, they can take the cookie and figure out who the user is. Final option is to basically not put that cookie in a table, or they'll basically have some web services that would actually validate the cookie, as well as this web services would be able to validate user ID and password if the user had not actually signed into PeopleSoft database first, but was simply logging in directly to the Oracle BI server. So a couple of support documents that are out there, in addition to the standard BI and PeopleSoft documents, cover specifically setting up some things with Oracle single sign-on, as well as this solution for basically putting the cookie into a table. In addition to actually talking about the security or authentication pieces, both of these documents have additional detail on how to get BI reports into HTML objects on PeopleSoft pages, as well as a bit more on using the PeopleSoft roles to populate BI roles and groups. So those are a couple of useful documents that you'll want to use if you are going to be doing this type of integration. So a little more detail again on this idea of using a token when you don't have a single sign-on server. So basically what would happen is PeopleSoft user would sign into PeopleSoft and they would have this token created when they log in, and the web server knows the value of the token, and the browser also knows the value of the token. So when you navigate to that link in PeopleSoft, there is some people code that will store the user's ID, the value of the token, as well as if you want to set some timeout limits, you can put that. And that information is actually stored into a PeopleSoft database application table. Then when you make that request to go to OBIEE, we're going to send that user ID and the cookie to OBIEE. We can do that by putting those things directly in the BI URL. We can also put those into the HTTP request header that goes along with that request. OBI receives that token and or the user information in when it is authenticating the user, and it will go out and it will query that PeopleSoft application table to say, is this person valid? So again, that is documented out in an Oracle support document, not in the standard PeopleSoft or BI applications documentation. So taking a closer look at the case study here, we had a requirement, again, to allow people to come in directly to the BI server. And along with that, we had the constraint that we did not actually have a single sign-on server or an enterprise-wide LDAP server. There were smaller LDAPs throughout the organization used by different departments, but no central enterprise-wide LDAP server. The only thing that was really enterprise-wide was the list of PeopleSoft users and their credentials, as every employee had to have a PeopleSoft user ID for entering time and being paid. In addition, we didn't want to maintain users in OBIEE beyond what we were doing in PeopleSoft. So to do that, we basically developed some PeopleSoft web services that would authenticate a user's ID and password if they came in directly to the BI server, and would also determine the user, essentially who owned a PS token cookie. And so those web servers would tell us, web services, excuse me, not web servers, from the PeopleSoft application would basically let us know if a user essentially is a valid user. In a bit more detail, what all happened through that process is, again, the PS token comes from the PeopleSoft application, and either that or a username and password is sent to the BI server. The BI server would actually execute some PL SQL functions using the token cookie value or the username and password. And they had the BI server here has to execute PL SQL because it's not able itself to execute web services. But the PL SQL functions in the database are actually able to invoke the PeopleSoft web services by sending web service requests to the PeopleSoft integration gateway. And the integration gateway actually sends the request on to the PeopleSoft application server, which will actually return a username for a PS token, or in the case of a username and password, we really weren't doing anything in the PeopleSoft service other than simply using the integration gateway and the application server authentication built into the PeopleSoft web services to say that the user is valid. And then the answer to that, whether they were valid or not, or what their operator ID, would go back out through the gateway to the PL SQL function and then back to the BI server. So what we had to do to get all of that in place, we'll start over on the PeopleSoft side. We first had to develop an authentication service, and under that, two service operations. One service operation, the get token, which would basically, it was a few lines of people code using the switch user function, and it would take the value of that token cookie and determine if it was a valid operator ID. If the operator ID was valid, that would be sent back. And the simple authentication service, which again, the people code behind that service really did nothing, but it was the actual integration broker and the application server that would validate the PeopleSoft user and password. Along with that service goes the message, the schema, the routing. We also had to create a generic PeopleSoft user because our service operation for the get token operator ID, we actually required a valid PeopleSoft username and password to come along with that. So that was a PeopleSoft username and password that we had to store in with our PL SQL function, just a basic security on that web service. So then at the database level itself, and again, this would be the most likely your PeopleSoft portal database or your PeopleSoft application database, but it could be the actual warehouse database. We need to make sure that XML-DB was configured so that we could have PL/SQL actually execute web services. Because we were on 11G and security was tightened at the database a bit more, we actually had to go in and do a database access control list to allow the Oracle database access to the PeopleSoft integration gateway, and then finally build some fairly simple PL/SQL functions to invoke those PeopleSoft web services. Then at the repository side, on OBIEE, we had some fairly simple initialization blocks which called these PL/SQL functions, and we would pass that either the PS token cookie value or the username and password that was sent to the BI server from the tool that the user was logging in directly to the BI server. So for authorization, and authorization is what kind of things can you do, not are you a valid user. In the repository, there's a variety of things that authorization covers. We can control who has access to particular tables and columns in that presentation layer. And again, that's for both people who are using the BI web application as well as direct BI server access. We can use data filters to basically add criteria to our SQL to limit things. We can limit query in terms of amount of time or amount of rows returned. We can control access to database connections. They're all things that we can use repository authorization for. Then in the actual web catalog, the reports and dashboards components that users are going to see, we can also control sort of the folder structure as well as specific reports and dashboards who can see what. And then there are also privileges along there, things like who can create new reports, who are administrators of the system, can you administrate a particular section of the catalog, and finally something like can you use the OBIEE web services that are available. And so all of this authorization is controlled in the BI side by roles or catalog groups. 10G, the BI roles were called groups. In 11G, they're now called roles. And the idea here is that we want to assign those roles and catalog groups based on your PeopleSoft roles. So again, not having to maintain roles in two separate places. So that authorization piece takes place essentially by using RPD, repository initialization blocks. Those are little pieces of SQL that run when a user signs in. And we basically use those to go out and get roles from our PeopleSoft application database, and we assign that to the roles and groups in the BI system. One thing to note is that the initialization block can use something called row-wise initialization, which basically takes multiple rows of data and builds a concatenated string for you. And things that we found when working with that, on the BI side, 4,000 characters seems like a lot, but you typically can find that PeopleSoft users can have hundreds of roles, and if we go out and just grab all of those PeopleSoft roles, we may end up breaking essentially that assignment of PeopleSoft roles to BI roles or BI catalog groups. So one way to kind of control how much of the PeopleSoft roles we're going to bring over is to use the PS roles class table, essentially basically create a couple of bogus permission lists that really aren't used to control access to any PeopleSoft pages, but simply can be used as a way to identify which roles from PeopleSoft should be used for BI authorization. Another thing that becomes an issue is that the role size field in PeopleSoft is slightly smaller than the role name and catalog group name fields in the BI tool, and this in particular, the presentation server administrator group inside of the BI catalog groups does not actually fit into a PeopleSoft role name field, so we'll see a little bit what we did with that. And a couple of things to keep in mind if you are now working with OBIEE 11G. That one thing is that the application roles are now defined in Enterprise Manager, not in the BI administration tool. So as you're adding your PeopleSoft roles to your BI system, you will have to maintain those in the Enterprise Manager. That idea of using role-wise initialization does not work when trying to assign the roles variable. And we'll take a look at the PL SQL function that was basically used to concatenate all of the PeopleSoft roles that we wanted to use for BI roles into a single string, and then that was basically processed by BI to assign roles. And finally, you have to be careful about special XML characters in the PeopleSoft role names, that you kind of filter those out from your BI roles. So here is the initialization block SQL that we use to basically assign PeopleSoft roles to the BI application role variable. And again, that first PL SQL function there, select M roles to string and cast and collect, is basically some pretty generic Oracle SQL we actually found out on the web to basically concatenate several rows of data into a single string where things were delimited by the semicolon character. So once we had that essentially big string of all of our PeopleSoft roles, we would have to go in and also replace the ampersands in there because they cause problems with the XML validation that 11G used. And finally, you'll see that not only are we selecting from the main table that stores PeopleSoft roles, the PS role user, but we're also looking at the role class table to basically say, only get the roles from PeopleSoft that we've identified as being a BI role. For the web groups piece, we had to do a little bit of a funny workaround in that in PeopleSoft, we were not able to create a role that's in presentation server administrators. We had to basically abbreviate that in PeopleSoft to say they were a BI catalog administrator and basically translate that on the BI side to say, okay, you're going to have the BI catalog group or web group presentation server administrator if you have the BI catalog administrator in PeopleSoft. So the final thing we wanted to look at is the data security. Again, a couple of different areas. There is simply controlling who can see what tables and columns in the presentation layer. as well as the catalog. You can see what reports and dashboards and what portions of the catalog. And there is also the row-level data access. What rows of data can we see out of the database? So Oracle, and this is something that came from another consultant, basically said Oracle delivers kind of a security roadmap, and you almost always find that customer requirements really necessitate that we have much more detailed control, or essentially turn directions. So what does come delivered? With the BI application, their data security is essentially we're going to use data filters to limit which, for example, departments or business units you can see. And we're going to apply those filters essentially to PeopleSoft application trees, which have been flattened in the warehouse. So the BI apps does not actually use any of the ERP application security join tables that most people set up. And initially there is no use of PeopleSoft security for authentication or authorization. You have to keep in mind that when you're working with the BI apps repository, it's designed for not only PeopleSoft, but Oracle eBusiness Suite, Siebel, JD Edwards. So you have to make sense of pieces that are out there for several different applications. PeopleSoft EPM product uses some security joins to filter data, but those security joins are not applied universally. They're only applied to a few dimensions in the warehouse, and they are based on the EPM security tables, which is something that essentially has to be maintained differently than the ERP application, and the delivered ETL tools and security jobs from EPM do not actually take any of the PeopleSoft application security. You basically build and maintain that stuff in your EPM application. And there's a couple of features in EPM for security-related trees as well as metric security, and those things are not actually readily available to OBIEE with the delivered product. So taking a quick look at our case study, again, we needed to basically have a little finer control over what data was available than simply using a flattened department tree or data filters. We also wanted to control what tables and columns users could query. And then there were some where we actually had to mask certain data elements from certain employees. So essentially we needed a much more detailed security system than what came delivered. So the column and table security is fairly simple in the presentation layer. You simply go in and identify tables and columns, and then within those tables and columns, you can allow access to those columns or tables or not allow access. So the one thing to keep in mind is, again, that this has to be maintained in the RPD, and there's really no way to tie that together with any other SQL-related thing. It's simply going to be a point-and-click thing in the repository itself. So to talk about, that's basic security, what tables can you do, but mostly we're concerned about with what actual data can you see in those tables. We've got several different ways to apply that security. We can use data filters, which simply add criteria to a SQL where clause. We can use physical joins, where we would join warehouse tables with some sort of security table to say, okay, this operator can see this row or this department department. And finally, we have the ability to use something called dynamic table names in OBIEE, which basically allows you to provide a different table at runtime. And you would basically select that table based on some role that a user has. Taking a quick look at the data filter feature, that's something that is applied in the business model layer of the, excuse me, not the business model, but within the BI repository. You apply it to either roles or users. Typically, we want to obviously use roles to simplify the maintenance of it. But you go in and you select basically, at a business model or the presentation layer. Here is essentially the table that I want to filter, and you provide a clause, essentially, how do you want to execute that filter. We'll try to zoom in there a little bit. Basically, we're saying that we're going to limit people to seeing data in our employee dimension, or excuse me, our employee organization dimension, which would typically be your business unit or your department. We're going to limit that to basically a list that is of departments or business units that's assigned when you log in to BI based on your user access. So, and you'll see that that then basically resolves to building an in-list type of a key or type of a criteria when the BI server executes that SQL. One thing to keep in mind as you do that is that there's probably some practical limits, and that doing security that way is okay when you have a few dozen or potentially even a few hundred departments that you would want to limit access to. But if you're trying to control access to lists of tens of thousands of employees, you're not going to be able to build those in-list clauses easily or efficiently. So for cases like that, we're going to actually do something very similar to the way PeopleSoft online applications or security work. We're going to join our tables to security tables. It's a little bit hard to read there, but again, we're basically saying, here we're going to look at, which particular departments does an operator have access to in a table based on their user ID. And we'll see that that is essentially resolved to joining up essentially the security tables along with the particular user, in this case administrator, who signed in to OBIEE. And finally, dynamic table names can be used for a variety of things. In our case, we use them basically to filter out data elements. There are certain people who had no need to see social security numbers, so we wanted to basically show those as asterisks, and there are ways to basically simply hide those fields. So we wanted to let people know that they can't really see this data. And then there are also cases where we don't want people to know that our secret agent is really named James Bond, but we do want to let them know that there is a secret agent position out there. And so that was done using essentially views in the database, and you would be assigned the particular view when you logged in based on the role. And again, that happens a couple different places. At the physical table level, we have to say what really is the name of the view, and then in the initialization blocks, when a user logs in, we have to determine what view really are we going to let them see. So looks like I accidentally included the delivered security slide again. Skip over that. Just kind of summarizing, coming back to our flow chart, we can see how we've basically tied our BI authentication, authorization, and data security into PeopleSoft. One thing we didn't, I guess, touch on a whole lot is in that middle part. You can see that we're actually going to take the security join tables, not just the roles and users out of PeopleSoft, but we're actually going to bring the security join tables into the warehouse. And then to make those more efficient, we actually have to convert those business keys, such as department ID or business unit, to those warehouse surrogate IDs, and then our joins are based on that. And it looks like we are just about out of time, which is good, because this again is just a summary slide of all of the things that we did to tap into our PeopleSoft security. So with that, I will pass it back to Christina for some announcements.
Great. Thanks so much, Mark. You can go to the next slide. So just quickly, because I know we're running up against the top of the hour, just wanted to tell you a little bit about BI Consulting Group. We were recently acquired by Capgemini in May, and we're happy to be part of the Capgemini family. Capgemini also recently announced that we have achieved Oracle Diamond Partner status. We're one of only 4 SIs that have achieved that status. Our average consultant has over 3 years of OBIEE experience and more than 10 years of BI and data warehousing experience. We have more than 300 successful Oracle BI projects under our belt, and a lot of them are against PeopleSoft implementations. We're also customer-driven and 100% committed to project quality and customer satisfaction. Go ahead, Mark. Quickly, we're getting ready to announce some new additions to the BICG webinar series. In August, we'll do a presentation around MDM. In September, we'll talk about OBIEE 11G upgrade considerations. In October, top 10 reasons to deploy BI apps with your next ERP upgrade. And you can see the next few for November and December. We'll be adding those webinars to our website in the coming weeks, and you can go ahead to biconsultinggroup.com to register in the next week or so. Before we wrap up the webinar, we'd like to give away some free training. As a token of our appreciation, 2 BICG University training tokens will go to Dion Jackson of Johnson Controls and Clara Carter of Stanford University. Congratulations to you. Mark, I think you've been so thorough that we don't have any questions. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. If anybody does have specific questions, feel free to go ahead and email Mark right there at the email address on your screen. And so thanks again for joining us today for the webinar. We'll send an email follow-up probably tomorrow with a link to the presentation as well as the recording. And again, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact Mark directly. Thanks again, and we look forward to working with you. Have a great day.